The trial of Richard Bruno Hauptmann, ultimately convicted of kidnapping the baby, was called the trial of the century. And the kidnapping eventually led to the creation of what is known as the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping across state lines a federal crime. Here today to discuss his 2012 book, Cemetery John, the undiscovered mastermind of the Lindbergh kidnapping, is Robert Zorn. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to begin by asking you, how is it that you became interested in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping such that it led you to write your fascinating book, Cemetery John?
First of all, thank you for the compliment. My hands kind of tightened on the steering wheel because my father was, although he had a great sense of humor, he was a fellow that was very sober-minded and serious, and so I couldn't imagine what he was going to tell me. He said, well, you remember how I told you that I grew up in a German neighborhood in the South Bronx? I said, yes. Well, I said, well, when I was a kid, a teenager, there was a man who lived 3 doors down from us, and he was a German immigrant named John Knoll, and he had come to the States in 1925 and moved to Jackson Avenue, where our family had also just moved in 1925. Again, my father was born in 1916. So my dad's story starts really in the summer of 1931, in June of 1931. And this fellow, John Knoll, took my dad on excursions. He kind of took my dad under his wing. My father was one of 6 kids. He had 5 sisters. He was the only boy in the family. And one day he invites my dad to go to Palisades Amusement Park in North Jersey. And this was like, for a kid in the middle of the Depression, this was like going to Disneyland. It was a really big deal. They had the world's largest saltwater swimming pool. John had taken my dad swimming in Yonkers before. Anyway, so they go to this park, which sat at the top of the Palisades Cliffs. And strangely, John does not go swimming there that day. So my dad goes for his swim. And after he finishes, he showers in the bathhouse and changes back into his clothes. And John and my dad are exiting the park. Well, outside the park waiting for John are 2 men. One of them is his younger brother, Walter, whom my father knew. John and Walter lived they rented rooms for $10 a month each from an elderly widow named Emma Schaefer. And anyway, but my dad did not know the other man, who to him seemed rather tall. Anyway, the men begin speaking to one another in German, the 3 men, John, Walt, and Walter. And John knows that my dad doesn't know how to speak German because my grandparents on my father's side had been brought up in the U.S., born in the U.S., and so German wasn't spoken in the Zorn home. So John felt free and comfortable about speaking in German in front of my father with his brother Walter and his 3rd man. But my dad, he's a pretty astute and sharp kid. He was a very, very bright fellow who ended up being the first person in his family to go to college, and ended up earning a graduate degree at Columbia University and so forth. But anyway, my dad picks up that John, the 3rd man that is there, John is calling him Bruno. And that they're talking about some place called Englewood. Well, then John does something very strange. Here he's got a kid who's 15 years old. He'd never been out of the state of New York before in his life. Of course, again, this is the middle of the Depression, and there was no money to be taking a family of 8 on vacations anywhere. And then John tells my father, you go on scram. You go on home alone. And of course, my dad said, well, aren't you going to come with me? He goes, no, you go on home alone. So my father was really shocked by this, and he watched him go off, John go off with his brother Walter and his 3rd guy, Bruno, that he was calling Bruno. So my dad is ferrying back across, and he was a bright kid. He knew how to get back to the Bronx and back home. But he's ferrying across the Hudson and saying to himself, what, looking at the dark waters of the Hudson, looking back at the Palisades cliffs and the park and the Ferris wheel at the top of it. He said, what was that all about? Here, this fellow is supposed to be my neighbor, my friend, and so forth. He's taught me all about stamp collecting, and I help him with his stamp collection. I'm hanging out with him all the time. And here he just ditches me in New Jersey. This makes no sense at all. Well, you fast forward to December of 1963. At that point, my father was the chief economist of the Republic National Bank of Dallas. My father he's 47 years old at this point, and he walks into his barber shop the day and night for. He reaches for a magazine, and off at the top of the stack is a magazine called True, and in it was an article about the Lindbergh kidnapping. Now, when Bruno Hauptmann was caught in September of 1934, this is 2.5 years after the Lindbergh kidnapping had taken place. This was the greatest manhunt in history at that point, in American history, the hunt for the Lindbergh kidnappers. And all that time they were looking for a gang. They were not looking for a one person, but they were looking for a gang. They concluded that multiple people were involved in this thing. So anyway, the gist of this article was that Hauptmann was no doubt involved in this thing, and he went to the electric chair in 1936, April 1936. But there were likely accomplices that he had that he never ratted out, that were never caught. So when Hauptmann was caught, all of the investigative agencies, the New Jersey State Police, NYPD, J. Edgar Hoover's Division of Investigation, as the FBI was originally called, and the Treasury Department's investigative unit, they all shut down their investigations. So Hauptmann goes to the electric chair, and nobody is looking for accomplices at this point. So
they had their man. They had their man, right?
They had their man. They had spent a fortune, and they were ready to have it done with. All these investigative units had spent incredible amounts of time and money, and they caught Hauptmann, and they then made the trial of the century, as you called it. They made a lone wolf deal, and anyway, so my dad's reading this article, and he's reading about of course, he knew about the name Bruno Hauptmann, that the name was well known. But when Hauptmann was caught, my dad was in literally his first month of college. He was the first kid in his family to go to college. He had 3 older sisters. So anyway, my father's reading about Bruno Hauptmann, and he's reading about how there was a man calling himself John who had collected the ransom in a Bronx cemetery. Now, there were 2 meetings between the intermediary, man named Condon, John F. Condon, the elderly educator, whom my grandfather knew from the Bronx Old Timers Club. And so there was a fellow named John who had met with Condon at both Woodlawn Cemetery, where my dad had just buried his own father in August of 1963, and then also one at St. Raymond's Cemetery, also in the Bronx. And then my dad is reading about how the Lindberghs had lived in Englewood, New Jersey, while they were built with Anne Morrow Lindbergh's very wealthy family in a 40,000 square foot home, while their own home near Hopewell on 389 acres in the Sauerland Mountains was being built. So my dad said, wait a minute, that day in 1931, 9 months before the crime took place, a guy named John is talking to a guy named Bruno about a place called Englewood, and wherever they were going, I couldn't tag along. So my dad ultimately believed that he came to the conclusion that cemetery, this unidentified or improperly identified kidnapper known as Cemetery John, who became known as Cemetery John, was in fact his neighbor John Knoll.
So he read that magazine and the light bulb went off.